The title of my talk today is The Power of Non-Verbal Language to Communicate the Ineffable. I like to use the word ineffable as often as possible because it was excluded from the last translation of the Novus Ordo Missae as too difficult for people to understand. So I have to get it in there. And gibbet, too, is another one I like to use. But in an article charmingly entitled, "Oh No, I've Become a Trad," Neil Addison tells readers of Mass of Ages, the magazine of the Latin Mass Society of England and Wales, about his and his wife's unexpected return after a period of over 4 decades to the Mass of their childhood. He writes of his first re-encounter with the High Mass, quote, "It would be wonderful but inaccurate to say that attending that Mass was a road to Damascus, wow, this is what I've been looking for moment. But the reality was that we simply decided it was sort of nice, and we could maybe go back occasionally just to see how this experiment was working. What we hadn't banked on was that the Latin Mass is subtly seductive. You think a little won't affect you, and suddenly you're going regularly. In many respects, the Latin Mass is easier than the English Mass, where I can sometimes feel I am being lectured at the entire time. With the traditional Mass, I simply have the chance to be present at a sacred event and time to pray." Unquote. I'm sure many of you can relate to what Mr. Addison is talking about. There are 2 things that leap out to me in his testimony. First, he calls the Latin Mass subtly seductive. He's right, but why is he right? What is it about the old liturgy that works in a subtle way to draw us into the act of worship? Second, he talks about the paradox of the old liturgy being somehow easier than the new one, in spite of the fact that the whole Catholic world was turned upside down in the 1960s in order to make the Mass more accessible, as the experts said. But accessibility turned into vernacular verbosity, and that causes everyone to be bored and to forget about God, about prayer to God. There are many reasons why the Latin Mass is so effective at what it does, so effective in communicating that which can never be put into fully comprehensible human words. When I say communicate, I mean it in the old-fashioned sense, entering into communion with, as when we talk of Catholics communicating at Mass, meaning receiving the Lord. For this is the crucial thing, not hearing talk about God, but meeting God, seeing him, tasting him. In my talk today, I will explore one of the most important aspects of the traditional Latin Mass, the dominance and power of what I'm going to call nonverbal language. I think it's fair to say that the classic Latin Mass, whether we're speaking of a low Mass, a high Mass, a solemn high Mass, or a pontifical Mass, is characterized by a sacred atmosphere, a prayer-saturated environment that helps us to quiet down and connect with God. What is it that creates this atmosphere? I'm going to talk about 2 things, visual orientation and sonic orientation. Imagine a person with no knowledge of the Catholic faith, or perhaps even of Christianity, deciding out of curiosity to step from a bright sunlit street into a church or chapel. As his eyes adjust, he sees a number of faithful dotted here and there in the pews, kneeling and looking ahead. At the far end of the church, in a more open area with more decoration than the rest of the church, he sees a group of men dressed in strange and elaborate garb, clustered round a large marble object with candles across it. They are all facing the same direction as the faithful. They are intensely focused on what they are doing. Their bodies block our view of their work, but they look as if they're huddling around a victim to kill it. It is clear, at any rate, that their attention is not focused on the people. Our observer feels that something very solemn and serious is happening, and that everyone in the building is, in their different ways, united in this action, whatever it may be. If, in addition, he hears chant or polyphony and smells incense and feels the hard wood against his legs, worn smooth by so many worshippers, 4 of his senses will be, like the 4 evangelists, proclaiming a presence to him, even if he is not yet able to recognize it or call it by name. Our hypothetical visitor he was lucky enough to go into a chapel like this one, or the fraternity, or the institute. Our hypothetical visitor has already received his first and most important lesson in the Christian religion, that God is the center of our attention, the goal of our strivings, the purpose of our lives. We have here a foundational experience of man turning himself towards the source of his being and destiny. As the old prayer says, I acknowledge thee to be my creator and sovereign Lord. Nothing, no amount of catechesis or homiletics or pastoral programs can ever substitute for this experience. Without this immediate and wordless awareness of God as the fearful and fascinating mystery, mysterium tremendum et fascinans, for whose sake we stop paying attention for a moment to each other and to this world, and stumble up to the edge of his domain so that his presence may infiltrate and permeate our domain. Without this, I say, there is no religion at all, no worship, no sacred liturgy. Christians worshipped ad orientem, or facing eastwards, for centuries before anyone thought to give an explanation in writing of why they did so. When the fathers of the church talk about ad orientem, they always bring it up on the side in connection with something else that they're talking about. It's so obvious to them, it's just assumed. Worship ad orientem is not a doctrine, though it has doctrinal foundations and implications. It is not a statement or assertion or text that we can analyze. It is a bodily posture, an action we perform, an attitude we take with our entire being. It is, in that sense, pre-doctrinal, pre-verbal, pre-conceptual. And that is part of the reason why it is so fundamental. The first things human beings take in after birth and during infancy are not subject-predicate statements, but simple, sensible images. Language and thought grow in us slowly, but the face of our mother leaning over us in love is there from the start, immediate, palpable, and determinative. The fundamental symbols of the liturgy are like this. They train us before we know we are being shaped by them. They determine our thoughts before we think them. They impress the truth on our eyes, ears, and noses, on our hands and knees. The gestures, postures, and objects of Christian worship are, for this reason, no less important than the texts of the liturgy. In my opinion, a Mass in English facing eastwards would immediately possess a more sacred character than a Latin Mass in which, God forbid, the priest stood the whole time facing the people. You can see this in the Anglican Ordinariate liturgies. The practice of offering the Mass eastwards teaches us, wordlessly, that worship is about God, not about us. Or rather, it is about us only insofar as we are from God, in God, and for God. Hence, even though, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, the liturgy is for our needs, since God, who is infinitely good, stands to gain nothing from our actions, it is still done for the love and praise and thanking of God, who is the source and fulfillment of our needs. Our need, in short, is for God. Our deepest need is to go beyond ourselves into Him. The very purpose of worship is to take ourselves out of ourselves and establish us in God. This objective orientation, we can't avoid the East, even in our ordinary ways of speaking. This orientation should be visible, evident to the senses, easily grasped by the mind, and easily translated into the movement of the will that we call love, which is ordered to the good outside of ourselves. In connection with this visual orientation is the sonic orientation produced by three elements working together: silence, sacred music, and the Latin language. Silence is, paradoxically, a theme on which there is so much to be said that we could never come to the end of it. It is important to recognize a few things about liturgical silence. First, it did not arise historically because people said, we want to have long stretches of silence when no one is doing anything. Sitting around in a group and doing nothing has never been a part of Christian worship. That's more like transcendental meditation or yoga. In reality, silences arose because ministers were busy doing something, either without words or whispering their accompanying prayers, and the result was a gap in sound as far as the other participants were concerned, especially in a larger church where people might be located very far from the sanctuary. In other words, the silences of traditional Western liturgical rites are byproducts, you might say, of the hierarchical and theocentric nature of the action. Everything is in some sense directed to God, otherwise it would not be liturgy, and not everything is for your eyes or your ears. The Roman canon is the greatest example of this phenomenon. The canon was originally said aloud. In fact, the Emperor Justinian, a busybody like most of the Byzantine emperors, tried to enforce its audible recitation by law. But already in ancient times it was said with a low voice and eventually came to be said silently. At the most solemn moment of the liturgy, when the words of the priest bring the all-sufficient sacrifice of Christ into our midst, or rather, bring us to the glorified Christ reigning in heaven, it seemed highly fitting that the priest should whisper it rather than recite it or sing it aloud. I am reminded of the words of Cardinal Robert Sarah. Quote, "Before God's majesty we lose our words. Who would dare to speak up before the Almighty? To refuse this silence filled with confident awe and adoration is to refuse God the freedom to capture us by his love and his presence." Unquote. In like manner, Joseph Ratzinger said, quote, "We respond by singing and praying to the God who addresses us, but the greater mystery, surpassing all words, summons us to silence." Unquote. There is a psychological paradox at work here. That which is silent is, in fact, louder to the ear of the heart than that which falls upon the eardrum. In the same way that we tend to notice when something is missing from a certain spot rather than when things are present where they usually are. To put it as simply as possible, when everything is visible, nothing is seen. When everything is audible, nothing is heard. The coming to be of the silent word is accentuated by the going away of organized sound. The real presence is accentuated by the real absence. Silence is the golden setting for the jewel of mystery. At least in the Western tradition, as it has developed over the past 2,000 years, lack of silence indicates lack of mystery. In a parish run by Father Robert Paisley, chaplain of the Church Music Association of America, I hardly need to tell you that the liturgy is inherently musical as well. We sometimes forget this due to the popularity of the Low Mass, which began as a private devotion for monastic priests and for the fulfillment of Mass intentions for the living and the dead, and eventually spread to parishes because of its convenience for workdays and for Sundays with multiple Masses to accommodate overflow crowds. But the Church's liturgical rites, above all the Mass and the Divine Office, originated in singing, and for their full expression and impressiveness are meant to be sung. The Mass did not start as a bunch of spoken prayers with music being added on later as an ornament. No, the two modalities were singing and silence. Contrary to what people might think, in history it was the pontifical Mass that came first, followed by its simplification, the solemn Mass, then the simplified version of that, the Missa Cantata, and finally the simplified version of that, the Low Mass. Singing is a heightened form of expression, conveying dignity, seriousness, joy, exultation, and carrying with it a peculiar emotional effect that goes beyond the semantic content of the words. In a uniquely powerful way, Gregorian chant, the music native to the Roman Rite, is words with wings, born of a deep savoring of the Word of God, in harmony with divine beauty, and capable of lifting the mind and heart to the threshold of eternity. With its unsurpassed variety of modal melodies and its unmetered free rhythm, this chant, instantly recognizable as sacred music, poignantly signals that we are in the presence of God and are there to offer him the incense of our lips and hearts. Pope Leo XIII says, quote, "There resides within Gregorian chant a great strength and a wonderful sweetness mixed with gravity, all of which readily stirs up religious feelings in the soul and nourishes beneficial thoughts just when they are needed." Unquote. There is no other type of music that even comes close to Gregorian chant for the otherworldliness that the Mass demands. Let me put it this way. Chant is not entertainment music or fill in the gaps background music or keeping people busy music. It is ritual music. That is, it embodies and actualizes and carries forward the worship of God, and therefore counts as itself a sacrificial offering blessed by him and bestowing blessings on those who fall into its waves. This is why St. Thomas can say that even if people don't know the meaning of every word being sung, as long as they know it is being sung for God's glory, that is enough to arouse their devotion. After singing and listening to chant for many years, I find melodies and words coming back to me at odd hours of the day and night, reminding me of God and of my heavenly fatherland. This music puts down deep roots in the soul. When we hear it start up in church, the very sound of it calls us to prayerful attention. In that way, I would argue that Gregorian chant is a fine example of non-verbal language, since there is so much more going on with it than mere words. At least the non-verbal aspects of it are the powerful side that I'm looking at. Ritual silence partners with ritual music to form a supernatural wildlife refuge for Christians endangered by the pollution of noise, chatter, ugliness, and disordered passions. It might seem odd to bring up Latin in a talk that's supposed to be about nonverbal language, but the reality is that a language is much more than a collection of exchangeable tokens for the immediate transferal of information. In his masterful book on the history, form, and theology of the traditional Latin Mass, Mikhail Fiedrowicz writes, and no one has ever said it better, quote, "If sacred languages existed in numerous cultures and almost all epochs of history, and still continue to exist, this fact is an expression of a fundamental human need. In the background stands a particular religious experience that shapes and changes speech and language. It is the experience of something supernatural, divine, transcendent, and wholly other, to which man seeks to respond by using a language that differentiates itself from the form of everyday speech by means of a sacred stylization. Here lies the origin of the so-called hieratic or priestly languages. Far from creating a language barrier, the sacred language calls to mind that religion has something else to say to man. The sacred language prevents man from dragging the divine down to his own level, and instead lifts man up to the divine, which it does not, however, reveal and expose completely to the human understanding, but instead indicates as a mystery." I'm still quoting from Fiedrowicz here. "Insofar as the sacred language in the liturgy is primarily directed toward God, it does not especially aim at imparting information in the sense of human communication. Here the language serves rather as a bridge between the profane world and the transcendent God. The sacred language, as a simultaneously human and stylized speech, seeks to create an atmosphere that both reflects and evokes a certain religious attitude in those who pray. Here the Church also proves to possess a thorough understanding of human nature, as in this way she helps her faithful to detach themselves from their everyday language, where each word recalls profane realities, and to feel even sensibly that holy other sought by all piety. The sacred language spreads a delicate veil over the truths of the faith, which protects the holy mystery and eludes hasty comprehensibility. A language that is not commonly understood suggests to the faithful that they stand before a mystery that eludes total transparency. In contrast, vernacular language counterfeits an understanding that is absolutely not real." Unquote. Dr. Joseph Shaw offers further insights. Quote, "Neither the inaudibility nor the use of Latin in practice creates a barrier of understanding between the worshiper and the liturgy, since members of the congregation can consult a hand missal, printout, or smartphone to see exactly what is being said, translated into a wide variety of languages. It does, on the other hand, mark off the liturgy as something special and distinct from ordinary life. When we enter into the Latin zone, so to speak, we are entering into a spiritual space. In this way, Latin powerfully reinforces the atmosphere created by the architecture and fittings of a church building, the special vestments worn by the clergy, the distinct type of music appropriate to the Mass, and so on. The Latin of the Mass was never, in truth, the language of the street or of the public speaker. Not only is it often flowery and poetic, but it is strongly marked by the influence of Greek and Hebrew and makes extensive use of repetition and deliberate archaism. It was always intended to be what it is, a distinct, holy language to be used only in the liturgy. One does not have to understand the Latin text word by word as it is spoken to perceive and be moved by the solemn character with which it clothes the liturgy. The meaning of the text can be immediately available to the worshiper in printed form, but the impression made by the form of the text, the fact that it is proclaimed in an ancient sacred language of unique grandeur and gravity, is also of considerable value." Unquote. So you can see Shaw there is responding to the claim, at least partially he's responding to the claim some people make that, in the ancient church they translated the liturgy into Latin, which was the vernacular of the day, so that's what we should do now. And he's pointing out, as many scholars have pointed out, that the Latin of our liturgy was never the common language. It was, even when it was originally used in the 4th century, it would have sounded odd to people. And that's been demonstrated. That's not just a claim that I'm throwing out there. One of the lessons we can take away from Fiedrowitz and Shaw is that language is never merely language. Language is never merely language. Its cultural history, the traits and associations of classic works composed in it, the very sound of it falling on the ear, all of this is born along with the language and often delivers as much impact as, or even a greater impact than, its conceptual freight. And this is why people still go to Shakespeare plays, right? Instead of reading the summary on Wikipedia. I know that for me personally, the moment I hear "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen, introibo ad altari Dei," I am immediately placed in a different zone. It's almost like when the angel takes up the prophet Habakkuk by the hair of his head and carries him off to Babylon. I don't know if you remember that story from the Old Testament. Except that it's in the opposite direction. The worshiper is carried from Babylon to the Holy Land, from the Valley of Tears to the Holy of Holies. In the past 60 years of wayward liturgical reform and abuse, far too much emphasis has been placed on the vernacular, as in a particular language spoken by a group of people, as if it is somehow the magic key to participation. For one thing, any vernacular immediately excludes everyone who does not speak it. And that includes people who speak a lower register of the language, as well as that forgotten group whose education equips them to grasp higher registers as more appropriate in worship, and who will be vexed by translations into flat, dull, gray, modern tones. What the reformers seemed, basically you can't please anyone with the vernacular translation. That's the point I'm making. What the reformers seem to have forgotten is that there is a universal non-verbal vernacular accessible to all mankind, the language of symbols. Be they colors, actions, sounds, or other religious signs, this vocabulary has an immediate, although at times perplexing, effect on the consciousness. It shows us reverence without talking about it. It shows us mourning or rejoicing without spelling it out in trite and laborious words. Example: a black chasuble, unbleached candles, a catafalque, and the repeated refrain "Requiem aeternam" instantly tell me more about the meaning of a liturgy for the dead than 100 books written on the subject. This brings me to my next major point, symbolism. I'll enter into this topic by making a general point. Nothing in the liturgy is ever merely practical or utilitarian. Everything is symbolic. If clergy process to the altar solemnly or casually, it's not as if the solemn entrance is symbolic, but the casual one isn't. Both of them are, but they signify different and contrary truths. If the clergy wear an elaborate vestment or a plain polyester drape, each is symbolic. If they speak in an ancient hieratic tongue or a modern vernacular, that's symbolic too. And likewise, if one speaks in a natural voice, and the other uses a microphone. I think microphones are great for lectures, but not in church, not for the altar. If they face eastwards with the people or face westwards over against the people, both are symbolic. If we are singing medieval plain chant or a folksy refrain from the 70s, that is unquestionably symbolic. As rational animals, which also means social and liturgical animals, human beings are not just wielders of tools, they are weavers of symbols. What we do and how we do it carries significance. It cannot be otherwise. When we act ceremonially in a church, we signify who we are, who we believe God to be, and how we construe the relationship. Once again, I'd like to quote a first-person testimonial, this time from an old college friend of mine who, like me, spent many years in the so-called Reform of the Reform camp, and who, like me, has crossed over to the ravishing beauty and thundering orthodoxy of the Church's traditional rites. A former teacher of ours had complained about a Latin Mass he'd attended. My friend wrote in reply, quote, "I'm sorry to hear that you felt bewildered at the old Mass. I felt that way when I first started going as well. Many things were foreign, but I decided to let the rite just be itself. After all, it developed naturally over the course of centuries, so it must have something going for it. I have to admit, it took some adjustment. It's really a different way of going to Mass, from an almost exclusively linear, literal left brain exercise to where I could let other faculties kick in. If you go to the old expecting the same experience as the new, you'll be bewildered, just like I was at first. The use of Latin was actually a relief. No need to have to take in every word for an hour. Letting the ritual actions and symbolisms, almost an afterthought in the new rite, come into greater relief. The Mass revealed itself to me first and foremost as an action of Christ, more than as a service or something we did. Words fall short and often get in the way, and by this standard, the almost non-stop verbal expression in the new rite compares poorly with the multi-layered symbolism and iconic ritualism of the old. When I stopped trying to make the old rite conform to my way of thinking as a modern, and trusted it to form me according to its own spirit, my bewilderment turned to peace and gratitude." Unquote. One of the most striking aspects of the Old Mass is the immense power of its wordless symbols. These take many forms: bodily motions and gestures, a greater number of liturgical ministers with more diversified roles, the greater number and variety of vestments. Ironically, in light of its reputation as the special preserve of Latin literate intellectuals, the traditional Latin Mass is, in fact, a much more physical and sensuous liturgy than the Novus Ordo. That explains why the old rite can so easily convey to the faithful a sense of the prayer of the Church, even when they are not following word for word what is being said. In contrast, a liturgy that is predominantly verbal and undifferentiated is much easier to zone out of, since the vernacular drone rarely stops, and there is little else to catch the mind's attention. It's like being in a cafe or restaurant, where you grow accustomed to not paying attention to what people are saying at the tables around you. Many commentators in recent decades have noted that modern Western culture, and for that matter, the rest of the world influenced by the modern West, is shifting from the textuality of the Gutenberg age to a preference for moving sights and sounds, that is, audio-visual interaction, looking, watching, listening. One writer on education says, quote, "Young people today live in a world of images even more than words. They can be enslaved through images, or else images can be a source of freedom, a way to a new kind of seeing," unquote. Therefore, it will be of capital importance that the liturgy appeal to all of the senses, especially sight and hearing, but in ways that are not bookish or cerebral. The traditional liturgy admirably suits this need, which is both pre-modern and postmodern, because, frankly, it is human. It manages to convey much meaning without the use of many words, through pregnant gestures. The offertory and the canon offer notable examples. The priest lifts up the paten towards the crucifix. He lifts up the chalice. He bows low before the offerings. He washes his hands. He bows again for the suscipe. And all of this is done in a soft voice the congregation cannot hear. There is something so eloquent about the gestures themselves that one can easily be absorbed by them without the need for any book or prayer or explanation. It's like a mother's calming touch on a crying child, or a lover's caress of the beloved's face, or a policeman's upraised arm stopping traffic. Wordless but effective. Indeed, all the more effective for being wordless. As St. Thomas Aquinas says, quote, "We exhibit signs of humility in our bodies in order to incite our affections to submit to God. Thus, when we genuflect, we signify our weakness in comparison to God, and when we prostrate ourselves, we profess that we are nothing of ourselves," unquote. Yet there is something more. The silent but definite gesture is open-ended in its intelligibility. It has not yet been pinned down by accompanying audible words so that it must mean only this and not that. Thus, while the offering up of bread and wine is not susceptible to an infinite variety of interpretations, neither is it prematurely and preemptively closed off by a script. Again, I'm talking about the experience of the laity. I think it's somewhat different for the clergy, but that's something we can get into. Watching it, the faithful can fill it, to some extent, with their own meanings, prayers, and aspirations. There is room for a healthy subjectivity. It is a kind of controlled environment for the free flight of religious imagination and feeling. So I want to try to illustrate what I'm getting at here. As I watch the priest lifting the paten with the host, or lifting the chalice with the wine and a drop of water, I could have in mind how the bread and wine being offered up to God symbolize my own life and labor and suffering, which I give to him to be transformed. So as the religious sisters used to say, put yourself on the paten when the host is being offered up. I could place on the paten, so to speak, with the host, a suffering acquaintance, a deceased friend, an estranged relative, a child or a grandchild who needs my prayers. I could marvel at how special the priesthood is to be able to offer gifts and sacrifices in atonement for sins. The thought might occur to me that the angels wish they could make an offering like this. Perhaps they have a holy envy at what man gets to do, which they, being bodiless, will never be able to do. I could think about the way Christ, summing up the whole universe in his person, is offering to God the whole of creation. Basically, anything to do with offering, sacrifice, gift, dedication, mediation, it's all compressed into these wordless rituals, which thereby acquire a kind of potency or weightiness that carries me along with the motions, even if I have no words or ideas in my head at all. On some days, I am awake, alert, and full of thoughts. On other days, I am tired, distracted, not feeling well, or reeling under the blow of some bad news. And on those occasions, I can just sit quietly and watch, and let the orderly gestures calm me and reassure me that the Lord is greater than my problems. He abides, always the same. In my own experience, I have made all sorts of uses of the silent times at Mass and the gestures I'm watching, so that the Mass has felt increasingly mine, in the sense of being something I have invested myself into, while at the same time remaining utterly objective, unchanging, the same whether I am present or not. It is vastly greater than me, so much so that it can become mine and yours and everyone else's without diminution or distortion. In this regard, it is like any great work of art. In point of fact, it is the greatest work of art in Western civilization. Like any great work of art, the possibilities of subjective engagement are nearly endless, but the work of art remains exactly what it is, pre-existing us and probably surviving long after we are gone. Pondering all this has helped me to understand why I always feel such a sense of spacious freedom at the traditional Latin Mass, and why in the years of my life when I was still attending the Novus Ordo, I came to feel imposed upon and pushed around by it, like a refractory child in the hands of an imposing schoolteacher. The classical Roman rite is so dense with layers of fixed prayers and regimented actions that it has a kind of inevitability about it, like a natural process. It moves along like a purling river or a soaring bird. Watching the priest go through the offertory and the canon, or watching the servers pass by, weave around, genuflect, and bow, is almost the same psychological experience of meditative peace as watching the river ripple past or the bird float in the blue vault of heaven. Today's fashionable lingo might apply the word Zen to my description, and yet the Mass is anything but an attempt at canceling oneself out into a cosmic oneness or nothingness. We are still bound to a particular apostolic rite suffused with Christian meaning, so our meditation invariably circles around and leads us back into the mysteries of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, and the glorification of the one true God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We will see the same thing if we look at the hundreds of symbolic actions and items used in the traditional liturgies of the Church, East or West. During the Latin Mass, the priest makes many bows, many genuflections, many kisses of the altar, and many motions with his hands. He frequently makes the sign of the cross upon himself and upon other objects on or around the altar. He moves from place to place with a studied step and a definite destination. All of these things are done for a reason. We can trace their historical origins and development. We can identify their practical purpose or spiritual significance. But these symbols are open-ended. They not only allow for, they positively encourage the faithful to see meaning in them, to invest them with meaning, as occurred in the flourishing of allegorical explanations of the Mass, which flourished in the Middle Ages and were bitterly deplored by liturgical reformers. Yet even subjective or arbitrary interpretations can be essentially in harmony with the objective referent, as meditating on the mysteries of the Rosary is essentially in harmony with the representation of the same mysteries in the Mass. It is like St. Augustine's rule for Scripture. Any interpretation or application that is not contrary to the Church's faith or to the sovereign rule of charity is legitimate. Indeed, was already known to God from all eternity. This ancient medieval exegetical freedom, exercised on the traditional rites given to us by the same ancient and medieval Church, has very, very often led me to notable breakthroughs in my understanding of the faith and how to live my life. The Old Liturgy has accumulated so many features over the centuries that, like a vast rambling mansion that seems never to run out of rooms, closets, attics, passageways, gardens, fields, or forests to explore, one really never sees it all or gets to the bottom of it. The Old Liturgy has a quasi-infinite number of hooks on which we can hang our thoughts and feelings. So, what's the upshot of all this? Do not be afraid to attach personal meanings to ministers, objects, or actions, or to adopt the allegorical meanings given in devotional literature and methods of hearing the Mass, if they help you to pray. One sign of a great work of art is that it makes room for and has the wherewithal to provoke many responses, all more or less closely tied to its own ingredients and drawn back into them. The Mass is the greatest work of art the West has ever known, exceeding all others in its intelligible density and its fertility of cultural power. Reading off spiritual senses from its literal sense is no less natural and fitting than doing the same with the narrative of Israel in the Old Testament. Let me offer a wonderful and beloved example. Here's Fiedrowitz's description of it. Quote, "At the elevation of the host and chalice, according to the instructions of the rubrics, the servers are to lift the priest's chasuble, which was necessary originally because of the design of the medieval bell chasuble and its heavy, richly ornamented material. He needed help to get his arms up, so that's what the servers were doing. Today, this custom is retained, despite modified forms of vestments, not least of all because of its beautiful and symbolic meaning when one recalls the woman with an issue of blood who was healed by touching the hem of Christ's garment, and then sees in this gesture a symbol of the sanctifying power that emanates from the sacrament of the altar." Unquote. Lest you might think I am saying that the traditional Mass is a sort of playground for the daydreaming imagination, I hasten to point out a fundamental truth. The Mass, as it developed over the centuries, always moved in the direction of ever greater coherence between form and content. That is, the ever more perfect expression of what we believe in how we pray. This is the unbreakable link of lex orandi, lex credendi. In other words, the Tridentine Rite is a fully articulated confession of the Catholic faith in all that it says and all that it does, what it contains and how it is performed, and just as importantly, what it prevents and excludes. So once again, I quote Fiedrowitz. Quote, "The exterior forms of veneration and adoration that belong to the classical rite of the Mass are the best way of guaranteeing the corresponding interior attitudes. Prayers of preparation, genuflections, and bows are not trifles that could be omitted without diminishing the faithful completion of the action. The interior encounter with the sacred must manifest itself outwardly, involving and being supported by an exterior form. The traditional liturgy insists that interior sentiments are plausible only if, at the same time, they appear in an outwardly appropriate manner. With the number of its sacred signs, the beauty of its altars, the preciousness of its chalices and vestments, and its ceaseless expressions of reverence, the classical rite guarantees this correspondence of interior belief and exterior form. This rite is, so to speak, safeguarded against a possible discord between that which one believes and that which one sees. Here is found the perfected unity and harmony between that which is to be performed and the way in which it is to be performed." And this sentence is such an important sentence. The classical rite does not require anything to be believed that one does not symbolically see. I'll just repeat that. The classical rite does not require anything to be believed that one does not symbolically see. Unquote. In this way, the traditional liturgy is the most grandiose demonstration known to man of the familiar axiom, actions speak louder than words. It doesn't matter if all priests and bishops started preaching the real presence from now until the end of time in every homily at the Novus Ordo. It will never make a difference, because the liturgical rite itself does not proclaim, now in hushed whispers, now in resounding cries, Jesus Christ, the King of Kings, is present here in our midst. Fall down and worship him. It is not poor catechesis that explains the Pew Research Center's discovery that 2/3 of Mass-going Catholics do not believe in transubstantiation. Rather, the form of Paul VI's liturgy is totally inadequate to its sacramental content. In a beautiful little book called In Praise of the Tridentine Mass, Father Roberto Spataro, not to be confused with the horrendous Jesuit Father Antonio Spadaro. So Father Roberto Spataro makes just this point, quote, "Objectively speaking, the old rite of Mass expresses faith in the real presence with greater devotion and, I would dare to say, conviction than the Novus Ordo. We all know well enough the ritual gestures of prostration before the Eucharist as the lex credendi becomes the lex orandi. Every time the hands of the priests must enter into contact with the consecrated species, he genuflects, much more frequently in the vetus ordo. Vigilant and diligent care is taken so that not even a fragment of the consecrated host may be lost. Think of the joining of the thumb and index finger by the priest from the moment of the consecration until the final ablutions, or of the use of the corporal and the other sacred linens. At the moment of the consecration, all the gazes of the faithful are joined as rivers into an ocean of love in adoration of the consecrated species. It is moving and edifying to see the faithful of every age and condition kneel down devotedly at the altar rail to receive the body of the Lord on the tongue, as with paten in hand, the gaze of the minister or acolyte accompanies the motions of the priest, anxious that every piece be collected and consumed. The whole Vetus Ordo is a splendid profession of faith in the mystery of transubstantiation. Unquote. The wealth of symbolism in the old rite is not, after all, so difficult to grasp, even if it remains always beyond our complete grasp, which is good, not only for our humility, but even more for our piety, since we will never feel that we are masters when we are only ever disciples. There is always something to catch hold of, or more likely, something that catches hold of us. Think of how complex the Asperges rite is. The intonation of a verse from the great penitential Psalm 50, taken up by the choir and the congregation, the priest walking up and down the church wearing a processional cope and sprinkling the faithful with holy water to purge their venial sins and call to mind their baptismal dignity, the bowing of one and all towards the sanctuary during the chanting of the doxology, Gloria Patri, et Filio, et Spiritui Sancto. This, my friends, this is Sunday worship. And Mass, properly speaking, hasn't even started yet. The Catholic faith must be in our bones, in our muscles, in our knees, in our hands, in our eyes and ears, before it will ever permanently lodge itself in our minds and become the dominant force in our souls. There's a famous popular psychology book by Gary Chapman called The 5 Love Languages. I don't know if any of you have heard of this book. I'm kind of interested in pop psychology, just to see what people are saying. Sometimes they have quite interesting things to say. His basic thesis is that there is not just one way to say I love you, but 5 distinct ways. And each person gravitates towards one of these love languages. They are words of affirmation, quality time, receiving gifts, acts of service, physical touch. So, if spouses desire the best relationship with one another, they have to find out each other's primary love language and make a point of trying to speak it. What I find fascinating about this theory is that it also seems to apply, mutatis mutandis, to the activity of liturgical worship. So the faithful have different worship languages, so to speak. Some of the faithful lean heavily on the words of the liturgy. These are the sort whose missals are carefully beribboned, tabbed, and holy carded, and who are quickly frustrated if they can't follow along in their missals because they don't know which votive mass the priest is using. He's doing a votive mass of the third finding of the head of John the Baptist, and you don't know where it is. Others in the church just want to spend quiet time with the Lord. They don't use their missals. They tend to be drawn towards the low mass and holy hours. Still others are looking for ways they can interact with their minds and bodies, not necessarily based on the words, but based on an economy of giving and receiving, of doing rather than listening or talking. They might imitate many of the gestures of the celebrant. Right? They like to make all the signs of the cross. Right? They are drawn to pray at the side altars, lighting the candles at the shrines. The Latin Mass and the environment it creates afford a broad scope of engagement for all types of love languages or worship languages. It has the words for those who rely on words. It has the silence for those who rely on silence. It has music and pageantry for those who lean on their senses. It has the physical engagement of making signs of the cross, beating the breast, bowing the head, genuflecting, and lots of kneeling. In other words, it speaks all the languages, going well beyond simple communication or the exchange of ideas to the reality of communion, that is, union with the divine present in our midst, but beyond us altogether. The end of worship is not to understand ideas, but to be one with God. Jesus, too, speaks all of the love languages, which is why he gave us our great liturgy in the first place, why he has preserved it for us against the sins of his representatives, and why he continues to give himself to us in the flesh, not only in the spirit. I have argued today that the Old Latin Mass communicates the ineffable, meaning the things of God and God himself, through a powerful non-verbal language or even array of languages. 3 consequences follow from this truth, and this is how I will conclude. First, if I am right to say that the Old Mass speaks a rich language of symbols and that these symbols are there for a reason, we should try to improve our understanding of this language. Although some of it is evident enough, as I was saying, it contains a lot of subtleties. As St. Thomas Aquinas says, the more we know something, the more we are able to love it, and the more we will love it, if it is good and beautiful. The more we know about what goes on in the Mass and the rich prayers that are used, the more fruit we can derive from it. And from there, we can move on to the divine office, right? So there's always more to explore. It pleases me to be able to say that there are more and better resources now available on the traditional Latin sacramental rites than ever before. And I mean that. I'm including the 40s and 50s. In my talk, I quoted Mikhail Fiedrowicz's The Traditional Mass, History, Form, and Theology of the Classical Roman Rite. That is an incredible book. I mean, it's a pretty in-depth book, but if you really want to get into, well, the history, form, and theology of the Tridentine Mass, there's not a better book that's ever been written. It just came out less than half a year ago. There is Father James Jackson's book, which probably many of you have seen, Nothing Superfluous, an explanation of the symbolism of the rite of St. Gregory the Great. I have copies of my 2 most recent books here today. I could list many more titles at every level or type of readership, for priests and religious, for parents, for children of all ages, for young adults. A heritage does not automatically defend itself or explain itself. It needs to be received, taken up, appreciated, fought for, and passed on, beginning in the home with our children in their catechism and theology instruction. Second, and in close connection with the last point, the Mass is all sufficient as the prayer of the Church and the offering of Christ's sacrifice. But it is not all sufficient for doing the work that each individual baptized Christian must do for himself, and that only he can do, namely, to come to Mass with the right spirit or disposition. Although God can and does perform miracles of conversion, in the normal course, he expects adults to cultivate the Spirit in themselves through daily personal prayer, Catholic family customs, good catechesis, and far more importantly than most people realize, the nourishing of children's imaginations with good art, good music, good stories, including but not limited to stories of saints, and poetry. As an educator who, for the most part, follows John Senior's philosophy, I can't emphasize enough that at least half of the battle for the souls of our children is a battle for the purity, nobility, and conformity to nature of their imaginations and memories. That's the soil, so to speak, in which the traditional liturgy is planted. Finally, if someone were to ask, what is the single most important thing we can be doing as Catholics right now to respond to the crisis in the Church and to contribute to its healing? I would say without hesitation, in the words of Father Roberto Spataro, quote, "Let us take care that celebrations of the Vetus Ordo are regular and dignified. They speak for themselves. They strike and attract those whom we invite to it." Unquote. Now, I know, not everyone instantly falls in love with the old Mass, and some may walk away in disgust. But many do fall in love, sooner or later. And this is often the beginning of a major turning point in their lives as Catholics, in their quest for holiness and in their ability to become part of the solution, rather than floating along with the status quo. If church history gives us any guidance, the long, hard campaign of restoring tradition will not happen by a sudden divine intervention, but by the diligent, faithful, dogged, and generally unnoticed efforts of Catholics like you and me. Thanks be to God that he uses even weak instruments to prepare and execute his victory. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen. Thank you very much for your kind attention.